Good evening, everyone. My name is Troy Marshall. I'm the Director of Commercial Industry Relations at the American Angus Association. I'm excited to welcome you to Angus University's next webinar, Tackling Timed AI. Profitability and sustainability are always at the top of everyone's mind, and I think this is a topic that is very relevant as we look to the fall breeding season. Tonight, Dr. Jordan Thomas, the State Beef Reproduction Specialist at the University of Missouri, will explain the basis behind timed AI and present new strategies and synchronization methods. Before we get started, at any point throughout this webinar, if you have a question, you can ask that to Jordan or myself through the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Just hit the Q&A button and type your question into the chat box and hit send. We'll be compiling all of your questions and answer them at the end of the presentation. Thanks for joining us this evening. We are excited to have Dr. Thomas, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Troy. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here today and talk to you as Angus producers. And it's really my pleasure to engage with the American Angus Association in a variety of ways. You know, we're really privileged to have American Angus headquartered in the state of Missouri and have a long history of good collaborations with the Angus Association, and just excited to see what the next decade holds. One thing is for sure, which is the next few months hold the fall breeding season for a lot of us around the country. Certainly in the state of Missouri, a lot of our producers are planning to breed cows this fall and winter. And so we thought it was a good opportunity to tackle this topic of timed artificial insemination. And before I really delve into the weeds, I'm going to spend a few slides just talking about what I see as the big picture, which is that, you know, with any tool or with any technology, we first have to ask some questions, you know, about our use of that technology. Of course, the immediate one we often think of is, well, does it generate a return, right? Does it generate a return on investment? Is it profitable? Can I do it? And that can I do it piece is the cash flow piece, right? So not just does it make sense to do it economically, but can I actually do it this year? Does it impact animal health and performance? Does it address a problem, or are we just trying to maybe cover up an issue, treat a symptom? Does it improve or degrade the resource base of the farm or ranch? Does it have these ripple effects or cascading effects that are positive or potentially negative? Even things like, just does it take me in the direction that I really actually want to go, you know, considering the quality of life that you want or other considerations. You know, we're not going to talk about every single one of these considerations tonight. Of course, we wouldn't have time. But we are going to talk a lot about this return on investment piece or the profitability component of using timed AI, and also some of these longer term, what I call ripple effects or sometimes snowball effects. So in terms of the return potential of timed artificial insemination or maybe reproductive technologies in general, I think it's worth thinking about, you know, how does an individual cow actually generate a potential return on investment? I tend to come at things from a little bit of a commercial perspective, but even from a seed stock perspective, we're really interested in what's the value of that calf, and then what are the direct costs of that cow that we expose to produce that calf. And really that gives us margin, right? It doesn't tell us if we're profitable. We may have overheads that are out of control, but in terms of the individual animal, you know, as a cow, how she generates a return on investment really comes down to that. And so when I think of a tool that I can use on the operation, I'm really thinking about, does that tool increase the value of the calf and or drive down the direct costs associated with that cow? And really that's how we evaluate it. But I think a lot of us have bought into this false choice that we have to be either a high productivity or high profitability producer, or we have to be a lowest cost of production producer. And I'm thinking here particularly about commercial producers. But you know, if you look at the data, the data doesn't really seem to bear that choice out. The data, this is some data from the Kansas Farm Management Association over a 4 or 5 year period, looking at cow-calf enterprises and their, you know, total variable costs and their gross income. So again, not taking into account, you know, some overheads and other things that you would want to know about. But how is this high third of producers generating more total gross income and also doing it at a lower cost? because that's really what high profit producers, high profit commercial producers seem to be doing. And so how do we actually generate additional margin? Well, this, again, I realize this is a little bit academic or uses some financial terminology, but it really does come down to the decisions that we actually make every day. We're trying to moderate annual cow carry costs. A huge proportion of that is feed, admittedly, but a big hidden cost of cow carry costs is cow depreciation. How much value are we losing, particularly in commercial females, every single year? And then also we're trying to increase the productivity per unit of production. I tend to think about that as, again, a commercial context, total pounds of calf produced, say, per standard animal unit or per acre. And then increasing the value of that product. And so the example you might use from a commercial standpoint would be the price per pound of the calf marketed. Obviously a little different consideration on the seed stock end. But the point I want to make here, almost every one of these pieces is dramatically impacted by reproductive performance. The only one we could maybe argue about a little bit is feed costs, but you may not realize how much reproductive performance is massively affecting cow depreciation. And often we don't even think about that as a cost, right? And you may not think about how individual animal reproductive performance is really impacting how much productivity you get out of, say, 1,000 pounds of cow. Or what the value that you actually receive when you market that calf is. So the big drivers of profitability, as I see it from a reproductive perspective commercially, are the number of calves that a cow weans over her lifetime. How many years does she conceive, calve, and wean a calf before she is ultimately culled? And what that really is, right, is how many years do I have over which to depreciate the development or purchase cost of that female. And that really is number one from my perspective. But number two is the weight of calves at weaning. But I'm gonna give a big caveat here. I don't think it's just weaning weight and the genetics associated with weaning weight. A big piece of that is the age that dictates the weight of those calves at weaning. So how early is she calving within the calving season, which again is a reproductive feature, right? How early did she conceive in the last breeding season? How old are those calves at weaning? And then lastly, the quality of the calves weaned. Now, as a breed or as a group of, say, Angus producers, I think we all really get that piece, right? We really get that the quality of calves matter. We really maybe value our Angus cows, right? But how much emphasis are you placing commercially on some of these other intangibles, right? The number of calves that she weans over her lifetime, the age and weight of those calves at weaning. So it's not just if, but it's when she conceives during the breeding season that really impacts commercial productivity and ultimately profitability. And here's the example I give. I think most of us would think of a 60-day breeding season as being a well-managed breeding season, especially compared to maybe what you grew up with or other examples that you might see on neighbors' operations or something like that. You may think, well, 60-day breeding season, gosh, I really got things under control. Well, consider even within that maybe well-managed breeding season, well-managed relatively short breeding season. If I think about how long gestation is and what happens when an animal conceives essentially on the first day of that breeding season, calves on the first day of that calving season, we know that females will undergo this period of anestrus, which is a lack of normal estrus cycles for a period of time after calving. And how long that anestrus period is, varies based on all sorts of factors. How old is she? What's her nutritional status? What body condition is she carrying? Presence of her calf. It's influenced by a lot of factors. But at some point, she's going to begin resuming normal estrus cycles, assuming the management system is correct. And in most cases, that female that's calved on the first day of the calving season is having normal estrus cycles by the start of the next breeding season. She's set up to potentially have multiple opportunities to conceive over that 60-day period. But here's why not just if, but when she conceives matters. Take a cow that conceives on day 60 of that 60-day breeding season. She calves on, roughly day 60 of that calving season. Well, what happens in that case? There's a period of time during the next breeding season in which that female is not even having normal estrus cycles. and doesn't even have an opportunity to become pregnant. So even without estrous synchronization, without artificial insemination, without any kind of reproductive intervention, these females that are calving late because they conceived late last year have fewer opportunities and really decreased success in that next breeding season. And this bears itself out in the published literature as well. This isn't all hypothetical. That's just a way of illustrating it. But look at this piece of data, for example. This is the day on which a female calves, and so day 1 to 20 there on the left-hand side of that horizontal axis, and day all the way out to day, in this case, 121 to 140. And this is the percentage of those cows that then fail to have a calf the next year. So why is it expressed in that kind of weird terminology? Well, I want to point out the date there that this publication was published in. This is a 1958 publication, okay? We've known about this effect for a long time. And look at that stair-step relationship, okay? Those females that conceive and therefore calve early in this calving season are much less likely to fail to have a calf. In other words, to fail to become pregnant in this next breeding season compared to those that calve late. That's a stair-step relationship really all the way through that. So I often talk about this multi-year approach to reproductive management. And I think about a snowball, right? The classic example we have of a snowball going down a hill and picking up additional snow and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, that can be a negative effect and it can be a positive effect depending on how we manage reproduction, right? We can actually make reproduction a little bit better over successive seasons, or we can lose ground. And one thing that we know from the published literature, and this is a somewhat more modern publication from 2013, some data collected by the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, in which they looked at commercial beef heifers on producer operations that were retained as replacement heifers, and what they looked at was based on when that heifer conceived, whether she conceived in the first 21 days of her first breeding season or she conceived after that point, how many of those heifers actually stuck around and remained in the herd, bred back as 2-year-olds, again bred back as 3-year-olds, again bred back as 4, just as a function of when they conceived their very first year. And I think it's intuitive to most of us that have played in the commercial or seed stock space before and seen the productivity of females over time. But if you think about how many fewer calves I have generated in a group of heifers that conceived late in their first breeding season, and also what this is really doing to the depreciation costs that I have on those heifers every single year, right? If I'm getting to this point in these later, these heifers that just conceived 1 or 2 cycles later than those that conceived very early on, if they're really falling out of the herd this quickly, what is the annual cost that I have to consider as depreciation of that heifer every single year? So that's a snowball effect in the wrong direction. And that's not just the female side, but it's also how much weight is that female actually weaning off each year as a calf, right? The same publication, just looking at the calf weaning weight based on whether those heifers conceived on day 1 to 21 of their first breeding season or in the next cycle or the next cycle in their first year. And so it's pretty intuitive, right, that first year those heifers wean a lighter weight calf if they conceived later in their first breeding season. But look what happens in year 2. Just as a function of when they conceived in their first breeding season, they're weaning a lighter weight calf. Now obviously it's because they're conceiving later in that next year as well. But that same stair-step, negative snowball if you want to think about it, is continuing all the way on through their first 6 calves. And remember, I also have fewer females remaining in the herd if they've conceived late in their first breeding season. So reproductive management is really a multi-year challenge and a multi-year opportunity. And so when we start generating heifer calves, for example, that conceive early in their first breeding season, and cows that are conceiving early each year in their breeding season, we get all these other positive snowball effects. We start to have early born heifer calves, right? And if I'm keeping replacements, all of a sudden now those earlier born heifer calves have greater weaning weights and pre-breeding weights. They're more likely to be cycling by their first breeding season. They have greater pregnancy rates in their first breeding season. They potentially are breeding back better as 2-year-olds. And obviously the steer calves are heavier, but there's also really interesting pieces of the published literature. There's a couple of papers here out of the University of Nebraska that are pointing to some effects that you might not initially think of, right? So those calves are weaning off at heavier weights. They're ultimately having greater hot carcass weights, but also interestingly in that paper, greater marbling score and greater percent choice or greater overall carcass value. So the age of those calves is really having an effect all the way through the production cycle. And again, that's this positive snowball effect that we can get going with reproductive management. Okay, so we're supposed to be talking about timed AI, right? And here I am talking about dollars and sort of systems type of questions. But I do that to point out what is actually happening in a figure like this and to really put an idea about what kind of value there is between these lines. And so I'll walk through this figure here in a moment, but at the University of Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station in Missouri, we have multiple locations around the state, and we have several that have beef herds. One that we're very proud of is the Thompson Research Center in Northwest Missouri, not too terribly far from Angus headquarters here in St. Joe. And the Thompson Research Center herd is a straight-bred commercial Angus herd in which we've really been progressive over the years about using reproductive and genetic technologies with the goal of producing what we call white tablecloth beef, so just very high carcass merit animals that are retained all the way through harvest and marketed on a grid so that we can capture that data. Now, Dave Patterson, who was previously in the position that I'm currently in as State Beef Reproduction Specialist at Missouri, he had just a phenomenal impact in this herd in getting them to use reproductive and genetic technologies. And so I wanted to point out just over a 12-year period at that research center, what happened as they went from a strictly natural service breeding season, and that's the red line here, to beginning to use estrus detection and AI, and then beginning to use fixed time AI. And what these lines represent is the percentage of calves of the total calf crop that are born by a certain day of the calving season. So for example, if I go out here to day, I'm just going to pick a day here somewhere in the middle, let's say day 21. If I go up there, it looks like on this red line, I'm somewhere around 60% of those calves that are born by day 21 of the calving season in the natural service herd. Now, that's obviously a well-managed operation from a natural service perspective, right? To get 60% of the calves on the ground in the first 21 days of the calving season, that's really quite phenomenal. But I want to show you what actually happens when this herd begins to implement estrus detection and AI. And so this is the next 5 years in this blue line of then beginning to use estrus detection and AI. And what's happening, right? If you pick any one of these days, particularly later here, you might say, well, there's no difference between those lines. They achieve the same pregnancy rate. But remember, it's not just if, but when females are conceiving within the breeding season. And not just if, but when they're calving during the calving season, right? And so as this line gets shifted to the left, that's essentially additional calf age, right? An additional value that we're capturing because of the use of estrus synchronization and AI. And also, you got to think about the genetic merit associated with, use of those AI sires that are potentially elite. And you also got to think about the multi-year impact of those females calving earlier and potentially having better breed back performance the next year. So in terms of timed AI, I think we often think that, if we do timed AI as opposed to heat detection and AI, I'm going to give up some potential pregnancy success. Now, interestingly, that's really not what was observed in this herd at all. That line continued to shift to the left. And again, you may wind up with a similar overall pregnancy rate, but look at when those pregnancy rates were achieved, right? All this area between these lines is additional value that can be captured in the operation. Okay, so in terms of heat detection and AI, this is certainly a valid way to conduct an AI program. And there's nothing wrong with doing heat detection and AI if you want to do that and you have the facilities and time and labor availability to do that. But I think sometimes we lie to ourselves a little bit about how good we actually do with heat detection AI because we talk about the conception rate instead of the pregnancy rate. So I realize it probably sounds like I'm parsing words there a little bit, but in reproductive physiology, we actually use those terms a little bit differently. And so pregnancy rate is how many pregnant females I actually achieved per the entire group of females. Conception rate is how many females became pregnant that were actually serviced. And so the difference there is, well, some of these females are not necessarily going to be detected in estrus, either because the accuracy of the estrus detection isn't perfect, and nothing's ever perfect, or because those females actually don't show behavioral estrus. Now that's actually really consequential, and here's the example I like to use. If I think about, for example, a really high conception rate, the kind of conception rates that people will talk about achieving with heat detection if they do every little detail right? So I'm going to use 70% here in that example. Well, that sounds really good. 70% sounds really good, but realize if I just slip just a little bit in estrus detection, I ultimately achieve a much lower pregnancy rate because I'm really multiplying these two things by each other, right? I'm only achieving this 70% conception rate on the 90% of the heifers or cows that were actually in heat and serviced. And it doesn't take very long if you slip on estrus detection rate or you happen to have a fairly poor heat response where you're in pretty marginal pregnancy rate territory, even with this quote-unquote really good conception rate. So the point that I want to make there is in heat detection AI, it's a function not just of the conception rate, but of the estrus detection rate. And so when we talk about a different system, when we talk about timed AI as a system, we have to use different words and we have to have different expectations and we have to realize what the advantages are. Now I always try to use this picture every chance that I get. These are some great friends of mine in the Dakotas, a couple families that really mean a lot to me. The Mason family of the Mason Knox Ranch and the Ogren family of the Don and Roy Ogren operation in Langford, South Dakota. A couple of commercial and registered Angus breeders that have some commercial cattle as well, but do have some registered Angus. But in their case, they've made a commitment to use timed AI, even in fairly large cow groups that are on extensive range conditions. And I show this picture to highlight a couple things. One is, this is a commitment, right? It's a commitment to work cattle in portable facilities, and all these are portable, freestanding panels, portable wheel corral, portable tub and alley, a couple of portable breeding barns. That's a commitment. It's a commitment to set that up. Sure, it's work, right? But what timed AI enables them to do is to apply the tool of estrous synchronization and artificial insemination in a way that almost would be impossible or certainly would involve a lot of labor in conditions like these, right? And so timed AI is this tool to really get that done. The other thing I try to point out is this is in particular a set of commercial cows, and that's why I mentioned that they do operate with some commercial cows, because there's commercial value here, not just genetic value that we can only capture in the seed stock business. And so whatever labor and time commitments and facilities were required to pull this off, and certainly there was some, they have seen the value of doing that year in and year out, quote unquote, for even just commercial cows, right? So why? So timed AI gives you several advantages. One is that all of the females receive estrus synchronization and receive an AI service. And if you think about that in comparison to the heat detection system that we mentioned earlier, that really is an advantage. It takes away that potential error that's associated with heat detection. And it also ensures that every female actually receives synchronization, in an AI service. And that's really important if we're trying to get females to conceive earlier in the breeding season. The other advantage is that a lot of these timed AI protocols include progestins. And progestins are really beneficial in inducing cyclicity in anestrus cows or in peripubertal heifers. In other words, getting some of these females jump-started, if you will, to potentially conceive earlier than they otherwise would have within the breeding season. And remember, that sets us up for this positive snowball from year to year, and also additional value even just this year. And of course, the other advantage is all that AI can take place at one time on one day, and it can be a significant reduction in labor and time commitments. I'd also encourage you to think about all of the logistic considerations involved in an AI program. And I think about, you know, pasture use and pen space, and the necessity of having animals, quote unquote, up for heat detection and accessible may just not be feasible in every case, but a timed AI strategy can really make it feasible in groups of cows where maybe you considered AI not previously possible. So I'm going to be honest here, though. Timed AI is not just, you know, just all roses and rainbows, right? There's a lot of, not a lot, there are a couple of disadvantages, and I think they're worth talking about honestly. And one of them is that by definition, this is a timed AI, and therefore timing of insemination is not individualized to specific females or optimized for specific females. So for example, in a heat detection program, you would often use what we call the AM/PM rule. You'd detect an animal in heat in the morning, and she would receive AI that evening, or detect her in heat in that evening, she'd receive AI the next morning. With timed AI, we don't do that, right? We don't heat detect, we don't individualize timing of insemination, but there's a time point for a fixed time AI at which all of the females receive artificial insemination, and that time point is really based on previous research, right? It's this research-based compromise, but it is a compromise, and we should be honest about that. And so that time has been really calibrated so that we get the best pregnancy rate, not for an individual female, not the best conception rate necessarily, but the best total pregnancy rate that we can achieve in the group of females with a single time point for AI. So the other disadvantage that we should be honest about is if a cow or heifer has not expressed estrus before the time of a fixed time AI, she's going to have reduced pregnancy rates, or at least that group of animals will in comparison to those that have expressed estrus. Okay, estrus expression matters. The hormonal changes that are associated with estrus expression matter. And timed AI doesn't necessarily achieve that in every single female. And so that's part of the compromise, but it's still an incredibly powerful tool because of what it can actually achieve. So in terms of taking that first step, right, there's a quote I like, which is the best time to start was 20 years ago, sure, but the second best time is now. And I would encourage you to think about things that way as you think about reproductive management, genetic management tools that you have available. You know, should you have been using these 20 years ago? Maybe so, but gosh, you better start using them today. And so you do have a lot of good resources that I'm going to direct you to. Big picture though, find somebody that you can connect with on this topic and don't just try to go it alone. I'm going to point you to some resources in this talk, but I really do think it's important that you lean on somebody as an individual, and that could be an extension specialist in your region. That could be somebody who's an extension specialist at the state level. I'm happy to work with you if I can help. Or a veterinarian that has some training in reproduction or some level of comfort in reproduction, or a professional within the AI industry. And I mention that because there are AI professionals all over the country that can operate a timed AI program as kind of a turnkey service and not really require you to go to an AI school and learn how to do all this yourself necessarily, but can come in and run a very effective program for you on your operation. And so lean on resources like that and consider spending the money if necessary to get that done and get it done right. So lean on them for advice about selecting a specific protocol and also for screening animals, not just heifers but cows, and if necessary trying to develop some logical groups of animals if you need to do some of that in terms of actually getting this done logistically or identifying the right candidates to use. So I will point you though to some resources that I think would be really helpful. One is an MU Extension publication that we have put together called the Guide to Estrus Synchronization Products. It's available at this link, and you could probably just Google it and find it as well, but it is available at that link. And I point out this one because it not only does it go through the synchronization products in a concise way, but it also includes some videos, and I think some of these are helpful, and you can find these on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page as well. It's just search for Mizzou Repro, and you'll find that. But we have, for example, this video over here is on placing cedars and handling cedars correctly. And it's really only about 2.5 minutes. And so if you've never done any of this before and some of these products seem a little bit foreign, I promise you can watch a 2.5-minute video and be an expert about how to put in cedars and do it correctly. And so none of this is really that hard, and my hope is that some of these videos will demystify some of these technologies for folks maybe that haven't had the opportunity to see it firsthand yet. So I'd encourage you to check that out and check out that guide to synchronization products. If you feel like your facilities aren't up to task, you know, that is a common consideration, common concern. If you're in the state of Missouri, this is a really great opportunity. It's a portable breeding barn that we have available through University of Missouri Extension, and there's several located around the state of Missouri. You can rent them for a very inexpensive daily rental fee, and this can allow you to move through a set of cows maybe a lot faster than you otherwise could have, because it's a double-sided barn. You can have 2 technicians working at once. Or you may just feel more comfortable about using this facility compared to a chute that you have. So it's a good facility. We also have a video that kind of gives you the bird's eye view of how one of those works, and gives you a detailed tour of what it actually looks like on the inside. And so check that out if you're interested in that. It's on our YouTube channel. In terms of selecting a protocol, these are the protocols that are published annually by the Beef Reproduction Task Force, which is a nationwide group of academics and folks from industry that really serve our industry by curating the published literature a little bit and trying to identify what are the protocols that are really working effectively at the farm and ranch level and that we are comfortable seeing widespread adoption of. That said, I realize it can be a little daunting if you haven't looked at AI protocols to see something like this and see all these protocols all over in all these different colors. And so what I would encourage you to do is again, lean on somebody like an extension specialist or lean on somebody like an AI representative and let them guide you a little bit in selection of a protocol. Honestly, even though there are this many options, there's often just a couple that are really commonly used and recommended. And so I'm happy to work with you on that. If you'd like to visit some after this webinar, you're sure welcome to give me a call or email. The other good resource, I think, is the Estrus Synchronization Planner, and that's also put out by the Beef Reproduction Task Force. And this is not only a great tool to schedule out a program and actually get it on your calendar and get a printed version that is easy to follow and keeps you on task, so to speak. But it's also a great tool to just choose a synchronization program that makes sense based on your goals. And so that can be a great first step or second step as you work with somebody who can advise you on what to do when selecting a protocol. So I also want to mention a little bit of new stuff. And so everything that I think we've talked about so far is a little bit general, admittedly, and I hope it's useful because it gives some context for why reproductive management is so powerful in a year-to-year way, and the value that it can add to our operations and the tools that we have available to actually get it done. That said, we're really focused in my program, my research program at the University of Missouri, in trying to develop methods to control the estrous cycle that give that additional boost and give a potential improvement in fertility or success with fixed time AI, use of technologies like sex-sorted semen or timed embryo transfer events. And so this is something that we've spent a couple of years really working on based on some other good data that's been published in labs as far away as Canada and Argentina, but it gives you an idea about just the scope of research that's been involved in this. I want to share a couple points on this real quick, just in terms of work that we've done at the University of Missouri with this new protocol 7-in-7 sync, which we feel very comfortable talking about in terms of use in beef cows. We've done research trials with over 3,000 beef cows on over 20 producer locations across Missouri, Kansas, and South Dakota, with really the full range of cow age and parity and condition and postpartum intervals, so typical commercial herds in most cases, a couple University of Missouri agricultural experiment station beef herds, one in particular that we work at a lot, the Southwest Research Center in Mount Vernon, really put up with us on a lot of good work characterizing some of the endocrine and ovarian responses to this program, and had a really great partnership with Cross Country Genetics, a veterinary clinic in Westmoreland, Kansas, and they're a great team there, particularly on the embryo transfer side of this project. But our topic tonight is timed AI, and so I am going to focus more on the timed AI results that we have with this program. And first, just to give you an idea about what this protocol actually consists of, this is we're calling it the 7 and 7 sync program because it's very much like a 7-day co-sync plus Cedar, except that it has an additional 7 days added onto that treatment schedule and 1 additional animal handling. And at that time, you place a Cedar a week earlier than you otherwise would have and administer prostaglandin. So that treatment schedule is prostaglandin and Cedar insertion on day 0. 7 days later, simply administer GnRH. The Cedar remains in place. And then 7 days after that, so on day 14, remove that Cedar and administer prostaglandin. And then timed AI is performed at 66 hours after that point. Now, if you're familiar with timed AI, you know that it's a little bit strange to administer prostaglandin on the front of this protocol at Cedar insertion. That's a little bit unusual in the systems that we currently see widespread use of. And so what that's designed to do is by treating with prostaglandin and then administering the Cedar, we have this really interesting effect in altering follicular maturity that we're presented with at the time of GnRH administration. And the goal is to really get a more consistent group of cows that will express estrus in a more defined window of time and achieve a higher estrus response. And that's what we observed. So on this new protocol compared to the 7-day co-sync plus Cedar, 82% of those cows expressed estrus before fixed time AI compared to 64% on the 7-day co-sync plus Cedar. And remember that estrus expression before fixed time AI is really beneficial because one of the compromises that we do make with fixed time AI is that some of the females don't express estrus. So getting a very large proportion to express estrus, as long as it happens in a narrow window of time, can be really advantageous. Now, the pregnancy rates with this are very exciting in the work that we have done, both with fixed time AI and with embryo transfer. So I'll show you again, the timed AI results: 72% with conventional semen, 52% with sex-sorted semen, and so still a little bit of still a reduction there from conventional to sex-sorted semen, right? We haven't fixed sex-sorted semen, so to speak. But really acceptable pregnancy rates with sex-sorted semen, considering this is a fixed time AI, and all of these cows received a service with sex-sorted semen. And then again, a 72% pregnancy rate with conventional semen, of course, is outstanding. Now, are you going to do that if you use this protocol your first year? It's hard to say, but of course, as any new user of estrus synchronization, you got to have reasonable expectations. But it does seem to offer an opportunity for improvements compared to what we would consider more the industry standard protocol, the 7-day co-sync plus Cedar at 61, was still a great pregnancy rate to fixed time AI versus 44% with sex semen. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I refer you again to that University of Missouri Extension publication linked below. And you can also probably Google 7 and 7 sync and probably find some information about that as well. So I hope that's been helpful. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I think we're going to take some questions, so I'll turn it over to Troy.
Great presentation,
Well,
Jordan. I guess as I was looking back, I found out in listening to your talk, I was guilty of looking at the success of my timed AI projects at preg check time, and I thought you did a great job of illustrating that so many of these economic impacts and profitabilities accrued over many years.
Yeah,
so that was kind of changing for me. We do have a lot of good questions submitted by our audience tonight. I would like to encourage you, if you have additional questions, continue to submit those. Just go to the bottom of your browser, click on the question and answer portion, type in your question and hit send. We'll try to get all your questions answered here this evening. If we don't, Jordan has been kind enough to agree to if you reach out to him directly, he'd be glad to answer those as well. Yep. And so with that, let me pull this up and we'll get to our first question. Dr. Thomas, does timed AI work better if heat detection is used?
Yeah, so great question. And so one way that this does happen a lot on the farm is a producer might perform heat detection or go through a heat detection period of time for some number of days or hours up until a point of a timed AI, which in other words, you'd allow some of these animals to express estrus and you'd breed according to standing heat using that AM/PM rule. And then at a certain time, and that would depend on the protocol you're using when that time would be, but then you could perform a timed AI event for those animals that have not expressed estrus. Certainly a valid approach to use if your goal is, hey, I want to get the maximum conception rate on all those early responders that I can possibly do, but still get all of the females serviced. Again, the trade-off there is labor. You know, you got to go through that work of heat detection. Yeah.
Okay. Another question we had was relative to costs. And did you have any general rules of thumb of what the costs are to do a timed AI project?
Yeah, I can give you a ballpark. You know, so for most of the pharmaceutical costs that you might incur with a typical timed AI program, you might think about spending somewhere around $20 a cow just in pharmaceutical costs. And now the semen, you could spend any amount of money depending on what exactly your goals are. Certainly, it's not uncommon for commercial units of semen to be anywhere from say $10 to $40, but it could be much higher than that depending on your sire selection decisions. Labor, of course, can be a deal breaker in some cases, or can really be inexpensive, particularly if it's your own labor and you maybe don't pay yourself. So, but labor does factor in, facilities do factor in, so that those pieces are moving targets. Okay.
Yeah. And kind of a follow-up to that was with your 7-on-7 protocol. Is there any advantages or disadvantages from a cost standpoint?
Yeah, great question. So the disadvantage is you got to work those animals one more time. Right. Okay, so there's one additional handling of animals, and there's one additional dose of prostaglandin. Right. Okay. Now, prostaglandin is not a terribly expensive pharmaceutical product, and again, whether you consider that animal handling to be all that much labor is maybe going to depend on how you count some of those costs. But that is the disadvantage, right? Now, that being said, if you put a pencil to the multi-year value of early pregnancies, it doesn't take a lot of early pregnancies to pay for some prostaglandin and an animal handling. So it's a little bit, the 7-day co-sync plus Cedar, as it is a wonderful program to use and begin using estrus synchronization, AI. I'll never tell you it's not, but this does appear to be an option to get a boost.
Okay. Now, using the 5-day system, we breed at 72 hours and then get in at the end of the day with 2 total units of semen they're using. The cost is higher, but for these in location of cows. What is your opinion on that protocol?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, so semen is often one of the biggest costs that you have in a program, again, depending on what your sire selection decisions were. And so I'm, as a rule of thumb, I'm not really a fan of this idea of using multiple units of semen and placing those at 2 different periods of time. What I would suggest is a better strategy if you're really trying to maximize pregnancy success is either to do heat detection and really tailor it specifically to the time and the timing of AI for or the timing of onset of estrus, tailor that time of AI to the time of onset of estrus and individualize it to individual animals. That can make sense if your goal is that maximum conception rate, and then you could do that timed AI for those non-responders like the first question mentioned. Another opportunity, you might look into the split time AI approach that we have an extension publication on as well. That's an approach in which you do a timed AI, but it's a little bit adjusted because there are now 2 time points at which a female could receive AI. And so that group is either inseminated at the standard time, or if they haven't expressed estrus, inseminated at a delayed time. So we do have an extension publication that walks through that a little bit better than I just did, but you could find that pretty easily. It's just called split time artificial insemination.
With the 7-7 sync protocol, or some of those protocols that have the Cedar in for extended period of times, are you seeing any problems with that?
Well, that's a good question. we have achieved those pregnancy rates without any sort of special kinds of considerations of trying to handle cedars differently than we otherwise would have or something like that. We haven't done anything out of the ordinary. So in terms of the impact on fertility, I'd be skeptical to say that you really made it worse, because obviously we got some improvements there. Now, anytime that a cedar is placed in the reproductive tract, there's potential that you have vaginitis in response to that. The degree of how likely that is to occur is really dependent on how you handle the cedars and how you place those cedars, the level of sanitation that you use. So I would refer you to that video that we have on YouTube, or you could find it on Facebook as well, about cedar handling, because we go through the process of having 2 buckets that we use to actually do that sanitation process, remove the gross manure off of the applicator, and then have a sanitation or sanitizing bucket that has chlorhexidine solution in it. Using that approach, we really don't see a lot of vaginitis, quite frankly. Another step that you could consider would be to use a lubricant that includes a little bit of chlorhex in it. So that would be like a chlorhexalube type of product, and that would just give you that extra little bit of protection, including a sanitizing agent in the actual lubricant. So a couple little practical tips.
Dr. Thomas, the next question, it mentions that the cedar on the bag, it recommends only leaving them in for 7 days, and so do you have any issues, or explain why you go off-label, I guess? Yeah,
so the cedar product is very commonly used in heifer programs for a 14-day treatment total. There's always this perennial debate about, should we be really conscientious about trying to follow exactly the label instructions as written, or are we just using the product in a way that's consistent with the intention for which it was approved in estrus synchronization? So as a university academic, I'm going to defer to the veterinarians because really these products are pharmaceutical products that you should be using in conjunction with a veterinary client relationship. It's my responsibility to make sure that we do synchronization work that physiologically makes sense and that is potentially impactful, but you do need to have that veterinary relationship to actually make sure you're using the products appropriately.
You talked about using the 7-on-7 program on heifers. Can it be used equally on cows?
Oh yeah, so the 7-on-7 protocol actually the vice versa of that. I would suggest that you only use that on cows at this time. And the reason I would say that is there hasn't been a published comparison trial of that program with what I see as the standard protocols that people commonly use in beef heifers, and that would be, say, what I would usually recommend folks use is the 14-day Cedar protocol in heifers, the 14-day Cedar PG protocol. There hasn't been a comparison with that, and there also hasn't really been a comparison with the standard 7-day co-sync plus Cedar as well. So until we see that kind of data, I'm actually a little bit skeptical of how effective this protocol would be in heifers. One of the challenges in heifers is we often don't have all the heifers cycling at the start of the breeding season. And we know that those long-term protocols are really beneficial in dealing with that problem. The other challenge is getting an effective GnRH response in heifers is also a little bit problematic in the literature. And this protocol involves GnRH right in the middle of it. And until we really understand the degree of response that we get in heifers to that GnRH with this protocol, I would steer away from it. And I would continue to use something like a 14-day Cedar in heifers. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, semen companies go from half to quarter cc straws. Will that change conception rates in your time to AI projects? And kind of a follow-up then too is, they asked if you have to wait longer to AI.
Okay, so completely valid questions. You don't have to wait longer to AI. If anything, those quarter cc straws theoretically ought to thaw a little bit faster because there's greater surface area to volume ratio. But in practice, you're gonna handle those straws the same way. You're gonna thaw them for the same amount of time that you otherwise would. You're gonna handle them the same way. Initially, when quarter cc straws were really coming onto the market, we were concerned that maybe producers would need to handle them with an extra degree of care, just because in a cold weather situation, do they cool down even faster and things like that. My advice, though, is I would be really cautious about how I handle any unit of semen, whether it's a quarter cc or a half cc, and I would be very conscientious either way. So continue to exercise, really good semen handling strategies, regardless of the straw size. There is a little bit of literature that would suggest that quarter cc offered a little bit of improvement, but there's only really 1 or 2 publications that showed that. It wasn't a tremendous magnitude improvement, so it's not going to be the game changer that makes all of the cows get pregnant, but I think we will continue to see companies move towards that quarter cc.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next question is about timing of AI. If the animal expresses estrus, what's the maximum time you have to AI? And they kind of use the example if a cow comes in heat at 3 p.m. So when should you breed?
Sure. Great question. So there's a rule of thumb that we use, which I mentioned during the talk, which was an AM/PM rule, which is that if I detect a cow in heat in the morning, she receives AI that night. If I detect her in heat that night, she receives AI the following morning. Now that's a great rule of thumb. The biology is a little different, but it works with that rule of thumb. And so the biology is that when a cow or heifer expresses estrus, that how long she's actually in standing heat is really variable from individual to individual. So there are cows that express estrus for incredibly short periods of time and don't stand to be mounted very long and only get a few mounts. And there are cows that are in heat for over a day. And so it's important to realize when is ovulation actually occurring for those females. It's really tied to the onset of estrus. It's tied to when the onset of estrus was, because around the time of the onset of estrus, we've had enough estradiol to drive that behavior and to also drive the surge of luteinizing hormone that induces that ovulatory process. So I said, that being said, that window of time from LH, or the onset of estrus, to ovulation is actually 30 hours. And I think most of us have forgotten it's that long. So there's a little more forgiveness in the system than we realize, but the literature suggests that the ideal time to perform AI after the onset of estrus is somewhere around 12 to 18 hours. And as we get much earlier than that, we potentially are reducing fertility if we don't have sperm cells that happen to live that long. And if we get too late than that, we happen to potentially miss when ovulation occurs and place semen a little bit too late. So the ideal time is somewhere in that 12 to 18 hour window. But in most cases, you have a little bit more window than you realize. And so actually once daily AI can actually work fairly effectively in heat detection systems, and that's somewhat common, particularly in the dairy world. So I guess it's a long-winded answer, but don't beat yourself up too much, but just keep that biology in mind. And for example, if you do have that animal that truly has her first standing heat event at 3 p.m., you don't need to worry about the fact that she's getting inseminated the next morning, because you're still well in advance of ovulation. Yeah.
We have a couple questions relative to the 66 hours to AI that you mentioned in the one protocol. And I guess maybe have you address the different protocols, some of those timings, or if there is a general rule of thumb for all that.
Yeah, good question. So I mentioned that timing of a fixed time AI is calibrated based on published research that we're trying to get a single time point at which we can generate the optimal number of pregnancies in that group of females. Now, some of those protocols are published to read like 62 plus minus 2 hours, or sorry, 66 plus minus 2 hours. Some of them will read 60 to 66 hours. And it's important to understand that's calibrated based on the research. So that recommendation is being made based on the research that's out there. Try to stay in that time range. In this protocol, since it's quite new, and most of the data that's out there in cows is data that we've collected, we selected that 66-hour time based on some preliminary data that we have, and it's our best guess. Now could 72 hours be the optimal time? Potentially, but I'm a little skeptical of these later times based on the number of animals that we have in heat. I think it's pretty unlikely that we see major differences in using like a 63 hours versus 66 hours and things like that. So 66 seems to be a very reasonable time to perform timed AI on that protocol based on when those cows are actually coming in heat.
Okay. Well, we have a whole group of questions on the number of days to start protocols postpartum. So.
Okay, also another really good question and a really important one. because our goal is to get this snowball effect going, right, and to get this multi-year kind of improvement. And so the cows that we really want to make progress in are the late calving cows often. We want to get as good of a pregnancy rate as we can on the early calving cows, but if we can move those late calving cows up, that's really beneficial. So that's where the conversation gets a little bit nuanced, because it depends how you define success, okay? If success to you is a really high conception rate in those cows, then you should wait and allow them to have some additional time postpartum so that you can get that good conception rate. If you're thinking about the multi-year improvement, I want to push those cows and try to bring them up if I can, right? So it becomes a little bit of an individual question based on what your goals are. In general, you're going to get pretty good responses to synchronization protocols when cows are in the 40 days postpartum range and greater. It's considered, quote unquote, safe to use these protocols in cows that are as short postpartum as 3 weeks postpartum at the time of Cedar insertion. Since I think so much about that multi-year improvement and that improvement from one year to another, I tend to be pretty aggressive and actually try to get cows that are those later calving cows moved up. Because even if they don't conceive to AI, in many cases I've induced them to start cycling, and they're going to conceive earlier than they otherwise would have.
I'm a big believer in being aggressive.
Yeah.
Does it matter what prostaglandin or GnRH drugs you use?
No, not really. And so there's lots of prostaglandin products on the market. Quite frankly, there's 2 prostaglandin compounds, and there are some generics of those, right? And so some of those prostaglandins are really even the same product. They're both very effective, and they're both going to be effective for synchronization and AI. And I would say even the same about the GnRH products. There's little pieces of literature out there that make you wonder about how much exactly LH do I get released from one versus the other. But in the projects that have really looked at fertility as a function of which project you use, any differences are pretty inconsequential. So you can trust those products really regardless of whose name is on them. Yeah.
Hey, and kind of follow up to that from a beef quality assurance standpoint, is there importance in where you place those injections?
Yeah, so BQA would like you to give those injections in the neck. And most of these products are an intramuscular injection. And so, we're concerned about injection site lesions in this business. If you can give them in the neck and get that accomplished, that's a way to be BQA compliant for sure. There is one product on the market, the Lutelyse Hycon product, that actually is label approved for a subcutaneous administration. And so, that's something also to be aware of, is we're moving in a direction as an industry where there's increased interest in maximizing the number of sub-Q products that we have, because we're concerned about that as an industry, and that's good to be responsible.
Okay. What protocol do you recommend for heifers?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of Missouri bias, I guess, because we're really fond of the 14-day Cedar protocol in Missouri. We've had so much success with that protocol. And so I won't pull any punches. I would recommend the 14-day Cedar PG protocol in heifers if you're willing to spend that cost on the Cedar. The caveat I would give is if you have heifers that are already being fed in a more of a feedlot type of setting, or they're already being supplemented pretty heavily, and you can make an MGA program work, in a lot of cases that can be really cost effective. It's not going to give you quite the synchrony of estrus expression maybe using MGA compared to a Cedar, but either of those protocols accomplish the goal that I see as really important, which is a long-term progestin treatment well in advance of the start of the breeding season that gets that cyclicity going in some of those heifers that haven't quite got there yet. Yeah.
If a cow doesn't come pregnant with timed AI, how quickly can you set her up again?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on how exactly you go about doing that and what exactly your goals are. So there are resynchronization strategies, and feel free to, probably don't want to go into the weeds on that tonight, but feel free to send me an email or give me a call sometime, and we can sure talk about a resync type of program that could make some sense. In practice, most people are probably, if they're really concerned about using a lot of AI, they're probably willing to commit the time to a second AI service based on observed estrus 21 days later, and just planning to begin heat detecting at the appropriate time after that AI to get that performed using heat detection.
Okay. Now this next question, we're going to see how aggressive you really are.
Okay.
What is the least number of days postpartum that you would start a cow on a 7-7 protocol?
Yeah, so, well, I'm going to give you another little nuanced answer. So I do tend to be aggressive, and so I tend to think I've got a herd of cows, a group of cows. I'm going to practice group management, right. And I'm often going to push that entire group. And even if I do have the cow or two in there that's 21 days postpartum, number one, I'm going to think about culling that animal, right? Because she's a late calving cow and maybe doesn't need to work on my operation. But number two, I'm probably going to treat her the same as the rest of the cows in most cases, accepting the fact that, yes, maybe I'm going to achieve a lower pregnancy rate. So the only nuanced piece I would give on that is the 7-7 program starts with prostaglandin. And estrus cows don't have a really meaningful response to prostaglandin in the same way that cycling cows do. I wouldn't expect you to get some kind of a boost with the 7-7 sync protocol specifically compared to, say, a 7-day co-sync plus Cedar in very short postpartum cows. So if you do try to do something where you've got different groups and maybe you've got a late calving group that you're going to push and treat differently, feel free to reach out to me on email. You may have some better strategies than that specifically.
This is a question relative to the 14 days with the Cedars, and can you reuse them after they've been used for 14 days?
Yeah, so it's not a bad question. I'm going to give you a very official answer, which is no. They're label approved as a single-use item, and I tend to think that you ought to treat them that way, and that you ought to really be concerned about sanitation and not trying to potentially spread disease from animal to animal by reusing Cedars. Now, to be very honest and open, particularly in other countries, there's been a lot of research using multiple use Cedars and trying to look at them in research context or even for application. And actually that gives me even more pause about trying to reuse Cedars because the progesterone dynamics are a little bit different in used Cedars. And so I wouldn't do that. I realize that a Cedar is an expensive product, but gosh, so is the semen, the time, and just the opportunity cost if you don't get those animals bred. So I would purchase new Cedars.
Next question, if you're going to heat detect prior to your timed AI product, would you move your timed AI back then to 72 or 80 hours?
Yeah, and that is what you typically will see in heat detection and timed AI programs. So programs that involve a period of heat detection and then later at some point we often call it a cleanup AI or something like that, a timed AI for those that have not come in heat. Generally, you're going to allow a longer period of time rather than picking that compromise point somewhere in the middle that you would have picked with fixed time AI. Now that said, I don't know if they meant that specifically in the context of like the 7-7 sync program or if they meant more generally, but the 7-7 sync program we've really tried to implement as a fixed time AI program because that's what I see as the future, right? And I see these really high rates of heat response before the time of fixed time AI, and I get really excited about that because I think it takes away some of the need to do some of these heat detection and timed AI approaches. And so just bear that in mind as well.
I like this next question. It's a little more technical. If you want to inseminate the animal 12 to 18 hours after ovulation and GnRH stimulates ovulation, why aren't you inseminating the cow? Why do you inseminate them at the time of administering the GnRH?
Oh yeah, okay, great question. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, the question is, in a normal situation where we perform AI based on onset of estrus, and we're trying to be 12 to 18 hours after that, and I mentioned that LH happens at the onset of estrus, well, why in the world do we do timed AI and then give GnRH at the time of timed AI and breed at that time? Now, it's a fair question, but you got to think of the logistics and also a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes. So in a fixed time AI program, we've already had a large proportion of those animals express estrus, and we're trying to do a single handling event for a fixed time AI and get a service accomplished in those that haven't expressed estrus. Now, could we administer GnRH and then come back and breed them the next day? Well, they do something like that in the dairy world where we handle animals more frequently. But in the beef world, there's just generally not the tolerance to do that. The other thing is you might actually be better off allowing those animals that would have come and eat to come and eat, and then who knows whether you should have actually given GnRH at that time. So some of those research questions aren't fully sorted out on the cow side as well, but that's a little bit more of a technicality. But that's why that happens that way. It's a logistics consideration where we're giving GnRH and trying to get the ovulatory process induced, specifically in those cows that haven't expressed estrus. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Thompson, I want to thank you. You did a great job. I think that's the last question here this evening. On behalf of the staff at Angus University, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope you'll join us for the next webinar, which is on October 27th, and it's entitled Focusing on Fertility, and we're going to have a really good discussion on the new AGI research fertility haplotypes, so make sure to tune into that. Also, as we finish tonight, we end here, your browser will be redirected to a survey, and we encourage all of you to provide your feedback on tonight's webinar. And please provide suggestions on topics for upcoming presentations as we move forward here. We are committed to providing you with timely, cutting-edge information, and we sure appreciate your input. The full recording of this webinar and the summary video will also be available on angus.org. Just go to the News and Announcements tab, click on that, and you'll be able to watch it. We sure would encourage you to share that with anyone you feel would be interested in tonight's subject. And again, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.